Hello, arts fundraisers, and welcome to the first video in our educational series on fundraising best practices. I'm Bob Swaney, founder of RSC Associates, and in this session, I'm going to outline for you RSC's basic philosophy and approach to fundraising in arts and culture. Now, don't worry, it's nothing too detailed or difficult. It's just good starter or refresher information, depending on your experience level. What we cover in this session will also help establish the tone for the rest of our video series. For those of you not familiar with our firm, it was established in 2006 to help arts and cultural organizations get better at raising money. Since then, we've helped over 150 arts organizations collectively raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and we've greatly expanded our services to help arts organizations thrive. We coach best practices that we've refined over these many years, and in this video series, I'll share some of those best practices with you. Whether you're new to fundraising or an experienced professional, understanding these key principles will serve as the foundation for your success. At RSC, we approach fundraising with a simple but powerful philosophy. Successful fundraising starts with best practice fundamentals and a commitment to successful relationship building. Let's set some context before we get into those fundamentals. For starters, here's a sobering trend. Faced with depleted funds and rising expenses and stagnant operating revenue, many arts organizations are in a growing struggle to balance their budgets. We understand this. We can categorize any organization into one of these three financial categories that you see on the screen. Your organization trend is either in deficit, it's stable, or it's in sustainability mode. So take a second and just think about where you would put your organization on this scale. And at RSC, we find that most organizations are either stable or in deficit, which isn't great, but it's a starting point. Let me define this further. A sustained organization, one in sustainability, has a healthy and growing mix of contributed and earned revenue, maybe even a strong endowment, but they're hustling to maintain growth. They're working hard to make sure that revenue streams continue to grow. Now, a stable organization, the yellow that you see there, currently has enough earned and contributed revenue to routinely meet their daily needs, but it's not necessarily growing, or it's not growing at the pace that they need. The red in deficit means just that. Expenses outpace revenue more often than not. This situation is sometimes referred to as a structural deficit, which is not anyone's favorite phase and one that we try to avoid. So think again, just for a quick second. Are you green, yellow, or red? Are you a sustained organization? Are you a stable organization? Or are you in deficit? A question that we often get, isn't stability good enough? Well, the short answer is no. And the reason why is because stability is less static than one might think. You could move to green, but you could also move to red pretty quickly if you aren't paying attention or if you make a few bad choices. There's no margin for error when you're in stability. Yellow is okay, but don't get comfortable. Use that position to drive forward towards sustainability, always towards sustainability. Arts organizations, therefore, rely on contributed revenue much more than they used to. How do organizations become stable? Well, we're going to talk about that just by looking at a snapshot in terms of revenue streams from 1990s compared to today. Arts organizations really rely much more on contributed revenue, and I'll show you what that means. If you look at this chart, you can see in the 1990s, and again, this isn't true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of organizations, their contributed revenue made up about 40% of their annual operating budget. And about 60% came from earned, and whether that's ticket sales, memberships, or class fees, or whatever that looks like, depending on the type of organization you are. This was a fairly common slice of the pie back in the 1990s. Now today, though, we look at a much different pie. The pie is actually bigger in terms of dollars, obviously, compared to the 1990s, but the percentage of contributed revenue is much higher. So we've gone up to about 75%, from 40% to 75%. We've almost doubled. Now, again, this may not be precise for your organization, but it's a pretty fair representation of what arts organizations look like. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting less earned revenue. The organizations get bigger and more expensive, and earned revenue just hasn't kept pace with it. That's pretty much what it means. And what most organizations have done is they've leaned into fundraising much more strongly out of necessity and need. But let's talk about, again, why fundraising is the answer. Say what you will, but we believe still, even with those percentages, that increasing fundraising, your annual fund, your major gifts, your endowment, even special gifts, is the long-term answer for sustainability. And that growth is possible in every single U.S. market, big and small. Like I said, we worked in over 150 markets at this point. We know that they have unique qualities, but really our conclusion is growth from philanthropy is possible in every single market. Why is fundraising the answer? Well, because it must be the answer. You can't cut to prosperity, and you can't continue to grow earned revenue exponentially. And huge endowment gifts alone don't keep pace with expenses and growth. Here are some of the realities of operating models that make fundraising the most reliable path. First of all, we've got fixed costs. And while other industries can adjust what it costs them to produce their product, our programming costs in the arts are pretty set from day one of a fiscal year. It takes a specific number of musicians to play a piece. It takes a specific fee to bring in a big exhibition or show. And if you own your own facility, there are set costs with turning the lights on and cleaning the facility. And so you come into that with some pretty big fixed costs that generally only increase year over year. The next thing that we know is earned revenue has a ceiling, which I mentioned before. Even if we're wildly successful in our marketing, there's still only so many seats in a concert hall that we can sell. There's still only so many people that we can put in a gallery at a time. There's only so many people in a classroom or youth orchestra. And so there are ceilings to being able to have more earned revenue. You could say, well, let's add more performances or let's add more classes. And those are good things to consider, but they also come, of course, with significant cost additions. That percentage of what it costs to add an activity versus how much money that you could earn from it, that gap is widening. So it's not just about adding inventory anymore. Earned revenue certainly has a ceiling. Fundraising, of course, as we said, is a growing piece of the pie. It has no inventory, which is an upside. It's a necessary investment. The upside for the patron is they don't have to dedicate their time to it unless they want to. They can write a check or put it on their credit card, feel really good about being part of the organization, and it supports a measurable mission of something that they really care about. That's different than being a consumer and coming to performances or coming to classes or coming to exhibitions. Those are much different things. All right, so let's get on the same page as we get into the details. Let's get on the same page about what's an annual fund. What is it really? It means different things to different organizations. And so we're going to set up our definition here. First of all, regardless of how you define it, please agree that all successful fundraising starts with a robust and growing annual fund program. It's where we identify the people and the companies that give at every level. It's where donors increase their giving over time, and eventually it sources project-based support and endowment gifts that we rely on long term. But for the purposes of watching these videos, let's use this as our definition for the annual fund. An annual fund is made up of contributed revenue that is most likely repeatable year over year and has an impact on your overall operating budget. That seems pretty locked down, and it's designed to be. The two key factors are it's repeatable, and number two, it supports your annual operating budget. So what does it not support? That means it's not one-off projects, it's not one-time major gift efforts. Don't include money that creates single-year volatility within your annual fund. It's the cornerstone of what you're doing, so you have to create a model that produces predictable results. That's why we're very picky about what gets included in an annual fund and what doesn't. It doesn't mean you don't fundraise for those other things. You certainly do. You just don't count it in the annual fund. Now that we've defined the annual fund, let's talk about who supports it. Who do we count within the annual fund? We really have 6 categories that we look at. The first one is the board. We do separate the board. I don't care if you have 3 members on your board or 30 members or 300. Well, I do care if you have 300 members. But it doesn't matter if it's big or small. Board giving is a pace-setting division, and so we want to break it out in terms of goals and results. That's the first one. The second one is all other individuals, and we might split those by broad-based individuals who give it at a gift below, name your number, $2,500 or $1,000, and then those who give above that. But for this purpose, we're going to talk just about individuals who are not board members. Next on the list is institutional. Those are corporate funders, sponsors, foundation donors. Sometimes it's government grants, and sometimes government grants are broken out separately. There's not a right or wrong on that. It's really about organizational preference and how they count it. The next one is events. So this would be your special events, if they occur annually, if they are consistently produced. So again, not a one-off event, not a single gala to open a new facility. That's not going to go in the annual fund because you're not going to do that every year. And then, of course, number 5 is fundraising by volunteer groups. If you're still fortunate enough to have a highly active volunteer group, they usually do some fundraising events for you and they turn the proceeds over to the organization. And I think that, again, is a reliable, renewable source of revenue. It's why we count it in the annual fund. Last on the list is the endowment earnings. So this is not when someone leaves a legacy gift. We don't put the whole legacy gift into the annual fund by and large. And count that. This is the 4% or 5% that the organization spends off of its total endowment corpus for general operating support. So there aren't restrictions usually attached to it. It's to support the operating budget. And I keep coming back to that, but I want to hammer it home very clearly. That's what we're looking for. Let me say one more thing about board and individual giving before we move on, and that is it will account for most of what you're doing. In fact, let's just go to that. Board and individual giving should account for the majority of your annual fund. In fact, individual giving in total should be about 70% of your annual fund. And so I would encourage you, once you get your annual fund categorized and you have the categories that we just talked about and you know how much money you're raising from each one of those, check it out and see if 60 to 70% are coming from individuals. Further, check and see if about 30% of that 60 to 70% is coming from the board, at minimum 30%. Some boards, if it's a big board, will have much higher than 30%. But unless you've got a very small board, 30% is a reliable number. Okay, the reason I'm bringing this up is, for the most part, we're going to talk in this series about individual giving. It's not that we'll ignore institutional grants and events and things, but by and large, we're going to talk about individual giving because it accounts for so much of your recurring annual fund giving. I'm going to wrap this segment up now, and I'll let you know that we'll finish each video segment with a few next steps, just a few things for you to consider based on the information that was presented. In this case, your next step would be to assess your current budget trends. You very likely know these, but if you don't, then study the past 5 years, maybe 7 years, although COVID still kind of gets in the way of that. But know where your revenue comes from, how much of it comes from earned, how much it comes from annual operating giving, how much of it comes from endowment and other sources. This will give you a very clear snapshot comparatively of what we recommend versus what you're doing. Number 2 would be to evaluate your board and individual giving. I've seen some organizations that do an incredible job of institutional giving, and it takes up a huge percentage of their annual fund, but their individual giving is suffering because of that. It's a real weakness. And so look at that, evaluate board and individual giving and see if it's making that 70% that I talked about of the overall annual fund. And then also, of course, if it is a 30%-ish coming from the board into that individual gift percentage. Number 3 is review the other sources of the annual fund. Again, just take a look at those, know how much each category contributes to overall recurring giving. If you have data for 5 years, study that data, take a look at it and see what kind of volatility might exist. The conclusion on this as we wrap it up is just the place to begin. The place to begin is knowing your numbers and the trends and then sharing that information with your board, your staff, and your other stakeholders. The people who are helping you with annual fund need to know these numbers, because if they know them, they can help improve them. It sets the stage for growth, and it helps drive your organization toward that sustainability, that green sustainability that we talked about early in this session.